I'm curious as to what your immediate reaction was when you heard this submersible, the very one you had been in, had disappeared.
Honestly, I wasn't sickened or grieving or anything like that. What I don't think the public recognizes is that this is not an airline. These submersibles are one-off. There's no spare. There's no previous version. There's one of it, and things go wrong all the time. Out of every week excursion, they have 5 attempts to reach the Titanic, including the week that I was out there, and usually they make it down only once, maybe twice, sometimes not at all. So mechanical problems are par for the course, happens all the time, usually little things. So when I heard that they lost, they don't have radio because regular radio waves doesn't travel through the sea. So initially I thought it was just a glitch.
Okay. I mean, you had experience in this yourself because on your voyage, you actually lost communication with the surface, or essentially were lost for 2.5 hours. What happened in your case to cause that? And then what happened during the time you were lost?
So just to be clear, I was not on that voyage where the sub was lost. And when I say the sub was lost, I don't mean that it lost communication with the ship on the surface. That's what's happening now. What happened last year was that the sub itself was lost in the dark on the bottom of the sea. It could not find the Titanic. There's no GPS down there. So the sub relies on instructions from the ship on the surface. And the instructions were not helping the sub to, they would say, turn right, go 100 yards. And they never found it. They spent hours down there just driving around in the dark.
That must have been excruciating. So if it's different from your experience, what then, just having had the experience, what is your thinking in terms of what could have gone wrong in this case?
I mean, really, there's only 3 possibilities. Possibility number 1 is that they are on the surface somewhere, bobbing away. This sub has 7 different return to the surface backup systems. So sandbags that drop off, lead pipes that drop off, the legs can drop off, there's an air balloon, there's thrusters, and one of them works even if everybody on board is unconscious. So one of them is a timed release thing that sends the sub to the surface after X amount of hours. So maybe they're out there bobbing away, but remember, they're bolted in from the outside. So they have no way to get out or get more air. So that's terrifying thing number 1, is that the Coast Guard is just looking for a white capsule in 900 miles of whitecaps. The other possibility is that they're underwater. And that's even scarier, because even if they're alive, if they're down there, even if we find them, if they're down there, we have no way to get them back up. There's no submersible that can reach those depths that can be brought to this site in time, let alone that has towing capacity. They don't. A submersible is not a submarine. A submersible doesn't have very much power. It has to be carried everywhere on a ship. And so it couldn't tow this thing to the surface.
So that what you've just outlined is what every official is saying is the worst case scenario if it's on the seabed, way those thousands of meters below and unreachable. And of course, that's why race against time comes into play and the discussion about how much oxygen they have available to them. The capacity we had in mind would be 96 hours through until Thursday. When you were in the submersible, I mean, did you discuss oxygen supply? Was it clear around you what the sources of breathing air were, David?
Very, very clear for me, because I'm kind of a techie and I really wanted to know. So there are carbon dioxide scrubbers. These are the same things they have in spacecraft to convert CO2 back into oxygen. If those fail, there's a backup system of scrubbers. They look like fly strips. They can be hung from the ceiling in an emergency. And if that fails, there are oxygen tanks, like scuba tanks, under the floorboards. So, and the 96 hours thing, by the way, is what the company says is the total of all these systems, but it has never been tried. It's a calculation. It doesn't take into account 5 panicking passengers.
I was going to say 96 hours, best case scenario, not people moving around, people who are not accustomed to deep water exploration, that kind of thing. As you say, breathing in heavily and panicking. So that, too, is a big question about just the actual number of hours. What were your impressions of emergency preparedness overall?
I mean, the whole thing is run like a rocket launch. So there are these elaborate checklists and inspections, and all of us, the entire crew, were required at mandatory briefings twice a day, 7 a.m., 7 p.m. on the weather, the state of the sub. To that extent, it was very well run, very careful. But when you talk about emergency procedures on board the sub, I mean, they gave us a fire training. There's fire extinguishers. There's a breathing mask for smoke. But beyond that, what could you do? I mean, you're locked inside a can, 2.4 miles down. The only thing in your power to do is go back to the surface.
Did you have any misgivings about going on this voyage as a result?
I will admit that the night before the dive, I did not sleep at all. I was exhausted. I was petrified. Once I was actually in the sub, and it's under the command of Stockton Rush. He's the CEO and the designer of the sub, and he's, by the way, the one driving. He's the pilot of the missing sub as well. And he told me that they've done 20, 25 of these dives over the last 3 years. Successfully, no injuries, no harm, no deaths. I felt better, and I was very excited to do the dive.
So you were reassured by what he said. What were your other impressions of him, having interviewed him as you did and seen him in action, as we await word of his whereabouts as one of the 5 men?
He's a really interesting guy. He's a blue blood. He's a direct descendant of 2 signers of the Declaration of Independence. He has experience designing and flying airplanes. He wanted to be an astronaut. He has experience designing and building these submersibles. And he freely acknowledged that this is not, it's not an airline. It's not a Toyota. He would say, safety is a relative term. If you want to be completely safe, don't get out of bed. So to Stockton, risk is part of life. And if you want to do amazing things, you have to take risk in exchange. And
you can't have been unaware of the risks in all of this. There are a lot of waivers to sign, aren't there, David?
You do sign quite a waiver. It is paragraph after paragraph, literally outlining all the ways that you could die.
Seriously.
It says, I understand that being on the support ship is very dangerous. The support ship is designed for the petroleum industry, not for tourists, and that I could slip, I could fall, I could get hit by a door, I could get crushed by machinery. It talks about getting onto the submersible. That could be dangerous. And then, of course, the dive itself could result in permanent injury or death. And you have to sign that.
And you did. And you have an experience to share, and you've been giving us some incredible perspective on having been on a voyage like this. At this point, David, and maybe you've alluded to it already, but what is the most worrisome aspect to you right today, this morning?
The single most worrisome aspect is that when they were 2/3 of the way down on Sunday, they lost communication. There's 2 sources of communication. There are these little text messages they can send back and forth to the ship, and then there's safety pings every 15 minutes that just says, we're still here, the sub is still working. Both of those stopped an hour and 45 minutes down, and there are only 2 things that could mean. Either they lost all power, or the ship developed a hull breach, and imploded instantly. Both of those are devastatingly hopeless.
David, we will hope that that is not the worst case scenario that we end up reporting on, but thank you very much for, again, your insight and sharing your experience. CBS, are you doing a follow on this, by the way, this weekend? Should we look for it on Sunday morning?
You should. This Sunday, I'm doing a follow-up story, including more of the interviews with Stockton Rush and the other characters.
Okay, we will certainly be tuning into that. Thank you again, David. I appreciate it. CBS News correspondent David Pogue from New York with us today.